Hi, I'm Debbie Waldman, and I'm going to talk to you today about how I went from this, words on a page, to this, a picture book. I'm hoping that my stories about how I wrote my stories will inspire you to write your own stories and maybe have your own picture book published. There are lots of steps involved in writing and publishing a picture book, but the first step, and the one that you have the most control over, is the writing. That means you get to come up with the story. You create the characters, and you dream up the plot, the action, what happens to move your story forward. That's all up to you. My picture books are all based on folk tales. Folk tales, to refresh your memory, are stories that have been around for hundreds of years. They've been around for that long because they're good stories. And because they've been around for that long, they've been told and retold again. Each version is slightly different. What never changes is the moral, the important message. My first book, A Sack Full of Feathers, is about somebody who gossips. The important message in this story is that gossip is not such a good thing, that stories spread like feathers in the wind. I did a lot of research before I wrote A Sack Full of Feathers. That involved reading every version of the folktale that I could find. Most of those versions were in anthologies, and there's lots and lots of anthologies that you can look at. I also looked for picture books based on a story about gossip spreading like feathers in the wind, and I didn't find any, which made me think, this is a good idea to write a picture book. Now, in every version of the folktale that I found, in addition to there being feathers and gossip, there was a main character, and it was always a woman. Usually it was an old woman who looked a lot like my grandmother's, kind of round and short, somebody who did a lot of baking and then eating a lot of the baking. I thought, if I'm going to write a picture book for kids, I think I want my main character not to look like my grandmother. I decided to make my main character a little boy. I think to balance out the fact that every main character of every version that I read in the anthologies was a woman. And I thought, I know boys and men also like to gossip, so I'll make my character a boy. But in one very important way, my character was like one of my grandmothers, my mom's mother. That grandmother worked in her father's store when she was a little girl, and my main character, whom I named Yankel, worked in his father's store. I decided on that detail because I wanted my character to be in an environment where he was going to hear lots of stories, so he'd have some basis for the stories that he was going to spread, for the gossip he was going to tell. And I knew that if he worked in a store, he'd probably hear lots of stories because the store was where everybody was going to gather. So after I decided on my main character, the next detail that I thought about was the setting, where and when I wanted my story to take place. I set it in the past, in late 1800s in Eastern Europe, in a little village, a little shtetl, we called them. Kind of like Fiddler on the Roof, the movie Fiddler on the Roof. Partly because I loved that movie, and partly because that's the environment that my grandparents all came from. And I wanted to touch a little bit on my family history. In fact, right around the time that I was writing the story, I learned the name of my father's ancestral village. It was called Olkanik or Olkaniki, depending on what source you looked at. And I thought, I think I'll name the village after my father's ancestral village. It was a nice way to keep my dad alive. So you can set your story anywhere you want. Just a little bit of advice. Make sure your setting makes sense, that your details fit the setting. In other words, if you're going to set your story in the 18th century, don't have your characters calling each other on iPhones or fighting over who gets the remote control for the television. Maybe if you're writing science fiction, you can do that, but it's gotta make sense because you don't want your readers so confused over the little details that they miss the whole story. The biggest part of the plot for me, the biggest challenge in writing A Sack Full of Feathers, was trying to figure out what kinds of stories Yankel was going to overhear and want to tell. I wanted stories that would make sense in the setting. I picked 3 stories. I thought that was a good number. One was about a baker making a cooking mistake. He mixed up the salt and sugar in some cookies that he was making. That was inspired by the time 2 friends of mine made me a birthday cake, and they forgot to put the sugar in it. And that surprised me because one of them was a really good baker. But I think what happened was they were having such a good time visiting with each other while they were baking that they forgot to pay attention to what they were doing. And the cake was like a brick. It was like a rock. It was heavy and it was impossible to cut. We had to throw it in the garbage. Anyway, that memory stayed with me because it was such a funny moment. And it was nice to be able to find a way to immortalize it in my picture book. That's something I've always loved about writing. It's a way to be creative and also a way to bring to life things that are important to you, like my dad's family's ancestral village, and things that make you smile, like my friends making a cake for me that had no sugar. I'll tell you a little bit more about the next step in my next video. Thanks.